Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing The Trial. This film came out in 1962. It was directed by Orson Welles. I've been waiting for a good 10 years maybe to review this movie, find an excuse to review it, and now that the Criterion release is coming out this month, it's like perfect timing. If you have seen the movie, I think you understand why I hesitate to review it, just because it's a tough one. I think the people who dislike the movie definitely consider it tough, but I also think the people that love this movie also consider it tough, and that's maybe why they are drawn to it somewhat. But yeah, just as an experience, it's not really a party. It's not entertaining in the classic popcorn sense, I would say. But for me, I've always considered it to be wildly intriguing, even if it is also incredibly frustrating. And this is adapted from the Franz Kafka novel of the same name. And I think it's quite ambitious to adapt anything that is Kafka, just because so many people consider a lot of his work to be unfilmable. But if anybody's going to take it on, it should be Orson Welles, I would say. And so far as the ambition is concerned, I would expect nothing less from an auteur of his caliber and his reputation. As such, he really does put his own spin on the material. It is definitely Orson Welles' interpretation of Kafka. I would say this movie has a major just sharpness to it, maybe visually. And there is actually a lot of comedy in this movie, and I think that's my favorite thing about it, or one of my favorite things about it, is just there's this very absurd kind of dark comedy aspect to it, and I just really enjoyed it, particularly in the first maybe third of the movie. I think Orson Welles is very funny. But, as I said, trying to take Kafka and translate it to the cinema, I think is just already going to be a very difficult thing to do, because Kafka is very abstract, and I think when you read his work, his use of language is it's almost like you're internally navigating something in a very specific way, and it's like, how do you interpret that visually and audibly? And with Welles's interpretation of it, there is a very sterile feeling to it. It's meant to kind of have a lifelessness, or like the life is being drained from it. Naturally very cold by design. And the first time I saw this movie, I was really starting to get into like historical cinema and like art house cinema, that type of thing. And I fell in love with the style of this movie, the aesthetic of it. I've always been absolutely fascinated by it. It's just one of those things that captured my attention. Obviously, at the time, and I still do, I always loved Orson Welles. His visual style is just something I really gravitate to. Obviously, deep focus lens, the name. I just love kind of the angular nature of everything. I love the shapes. I love the deep shadow and the contrast, the sound design. And, there's just kind of like a trippy, kind of floaty, distorted type of feeling to it. And that is also just my natural bias. Anything that Orson Welles does, whether it is working fully or not, it's going to have me in the palm of its hand. It's a given. And as is expected, the movie is absolutely stunning. If I had to think of like the top 5 directors in the world in time that I think utilize black and white photography the best, Orson Welles has to be in that top 5, at least, again, for me. And I can't get over how modern his movies feel. In this movie, it feels incredibly modern. It honestly reminds me of something like a Christopher Nolan film. And I'm actually kind of surprised that this movie hasn't caught on a bit more so far as cult status is concerned. But with the Criterion release, maybe that will change. But yeah, just visually, I love his use of kind of long lines, a lot of minimalism for sure. It has that kind of Gestapo energy, in the architecture. And this movie's heavily emphasizing the look, the architecture. It feels like a European dystopia, which is totally the point. And there's a lot of the European history, dark history, that's kind of echoing through, like with the Holocaust imagery, the noir imagery. And I just love that minimalism of the more modern architecture and how it's constantly contrasted with that more kind of that old historical opulent architecture of Europe. And yeah, it really sets a mood. It makes the movie feel incredibly massive. Now, this movie so far is how it handles the narrative as an experience. Sometimes I love it. Sometimes I'm falling into it in a really engaged way. And at other times I find myself really fighting it. This is a movie about just a normal guy. His name is Joseph K, and he lives in an apartment. He has a job just like anybody else. Suddenly one morning he wakes up and there are 2 men in his room, and they say that he is under arrest. And he goes, "Whoa, why am I under arrest? What did I do?" And they won't tell him. And really, that's it. That's the premise of the movie. It is a movie about a man who has been accused, and he's not sure why, and he spends the rest of the movie trying to figure it out. And we are warned by Orson Welles at the beginning of the movie that this movie is going to operate more like the logic of a nightmare, not the logic of reality. And that opening scene that takes place in his bedroom, in his apartment, I really think it's fantastic. I think it's maybe one of the best things in the entire movie. It's just eerie, and especially the way that it unfolds. It's dreamy and bizarre, and it's slowly turning into something claustrophobic and very much like a nightmare, but it's a subtle nightmare slowly leaking in. And I love the camera. I love that Orson Welles, he doesn't use a bunch of cutting a lot of the time. He loves to use very long camera shots, and it really draws you into the experience here, and it really creates the tension and that claustrophobia between Kay and the people trying to arrest him here. I think it's this scene that is the most dreamy, or achieves the most dreamlike state in a way that is most satisfying to me in the movie. It reminds me of, like, when you have those dreams that are so annoying where it's like, maybe you're having a dream where you're back in middle school or something, and the bell rings and you're trying to leave school and get home, but for some reason, some obstacle always comes in your way. No matter what, you can't leave the building. It's one of those types of nightmares. It's like an itch you can't scratch. And I have to, in some respects, really appreciate that type of feeling and the direction that it goes, even if I don't think that Orson is always pulling it off, because yeah, you might be confused at times what some of these scenes, the point of some of these scenes. And it feels as if everything is kind of passing through Kay, as if he is not solid matter. He is a ghost. No one here is real. Everything that you want is just out of reach. These kinds of things, they'll drive you insane. And I suppose my problem with the movie is it feels more like an intellectual exercise, a cerebral exercise, rather than, trying to form something concrete. But, again, that is also by design. Characters don't feel like characters here. They feel more like concepts. And that is partially why I say this reminds me very much of a Christopher Nolan type of movie. And I would not be surprised if he isn't heavily inspired by this movie, at least aesthetically. We all know that I admire Nolan to a degree, and I admire how bold he is so far as, going into the abstract, and really that sleek style that he has is very interesting, but it often fails to become a fully dimensional experience for me. And it's the same with this movie. I find the abstractions very intriguing, but ultimately it does feel hollow at the end of the day. I think it's getting a little bit too lost in the abstractions, to the point where there's really not enough tangibility, particularly in the second act and in the third act. And, as I said, Kafka is very abstract in nature, but I'm not sure Wells has found the way to make that accessible visually, finding the right angle to tackle everything where it is materializing, even though, as I said, I'm loving a lot of things in this movie. One of the things I love so much about the opening is how it's so slippery. You're really not sure if Kay is awake, or if he's like, kind of half awake, or if it's fully, he's fully submerged in the dream world. And a lot of what we arrive at so far is concrete information and kind of the emotional quality to it. The things that bring me into the movie in that first act is it's the characters and the way that they're slowly kind of creating this tension. I think that opening scene, why it works, is there's an objective, and there's something very concrete that matters, not only to Kay, but the other characters in the scene as well. And yet, again, it's still just very surreal and perplexing. And we get a good sense of who Kay is early on, at least the version that Wells has interpreted for us. Because so far as Wells is concerned, he describes Kay as somebody who's very normal, somebody who is ambitious, who's wanting to climb the ladder of success in whichever way he can, even if that means being selfish or greedy. But ultimately, I think he sees Kay as complicated. I think he sees him as very guilty of all kinds of things, but he's also a victim at the same time. Though he's definitely leaning towards the feeling of guilt that he holds within himself for whatever reason, and we're never really going to find out what that is. I know it's tough to do in a dream situation, but I did want that character and other characters around him to be explored more through, solid, something concrete, some action where those interactions have a little bit more meaning to me. So there's some meat on the bone there, and we feel kind of that weight of consequence that's possibly around the corner. It's not just a lot of symbols that are floating around. It's a little bit too breathy for my taste when I really want some punch. But I'm always very torn when it comes to it, because I recognize that this movie is not supposed to be like a lot of other movies, even for Orson Welles. And, even though I have a lot of complaints about it, I do enjoy the very surreal presentation of it. Orson really, he trusts in the intelligence of his audience, and that's really great. And, even though it's not always working for me, I always love the abstract presentation to it. I just wish there was some more, like I said, some more meat on the bone. Those abstractions don't build, I feel like, to anything, and they don't really create any traction that we really need as we go into the movie. And so they start to wear thin for me, and I do start to really feel tired by the pacing of it. The movie has a very uneven feeling to it, and it's just a real shame because it reminds me, quite frankly, of like the Magnificent Ambersons, though not quite to that degree. But I just, like I said, I just love the opening of this movie. I love just the strange feeling of it, the tension to it, and it's hella unsettling, and it continues at times. The movie really does go into some very unsettling sections that I just love. But then it's just something about the editing, like the ending, as an example, to me is way too abrupt, because that's supposed to be your big climax. This is your moment of realization, for Joseph K, that his case is going poorly. And you have this moment with this priest that should be very significant and powerful, and yet, yeah, it just feels like this really quick thing. You barely remember it. And then in the following scene is the big, conclusion. It's over, and you're like, okay. I do think it's very interesting that a lot of people, when you watch movies, if you talk to somebody who's watched a movie, they almost always remember maybe the opening. They might remember a scene in the middle. They almost never remembered the scenes at the end. And that's not often the case for me, but it is the case for me with this movie. I find myself, like, the opening is burned into my brain. Certain scenes in the movie are burned into my brain. Even in the third act, there are certain scenes that are they're so memorable to me. And yet the last two scenes, I almost never remember that they exist at all. And I think it is just for that very simple reason of they're just not sticking the landing, and they don't have anything that feels really meaningful, that encompasses a lot of what the movie is trying to say. And I don't know why that is. And something is just off here, I think, even just in the basic writing of Joseph K. I think obviously there's a lack of tension in the movie. And I think part of that is because K is very self-aware, I think, as a character. So then when he's so aware, the monotony of that structure and going from character to character that he encounters and, gaining something from it, it isn't always working for me. And a lot of times it doesn't even feel like he's gaining much. But having said all of that, I do find this version of Joseph K to be very interesting. Anthony Perkins is playing him. And I really love that guy as an actor. I think he's got something very complicated in his work, just because, he's got a charm to him, but yet there's always this melancholy to him, or something that is just slightly awkward, something where he feels maybe a little bit uncomfortable in his own skin or uncomfortable around people. And they really use that to perfect effect when he plays, of course, his most iconic role, Norman Bates, in Psycho. But they're using that here just in a different way. I think Wells knew that Anthony Perkins was a closeted gay man at the time, and nobody knew that, obviously. He was closeted. But I love that they use that underlying thing in him without telling anybody, and they use that to great effect. I think I really feel that sense of guilt in him, just because of his body language, and it's just in his face. But I also just think that whole aspect is it's meant to be cheeky. And like I said, the humor in this movie is one of the best things about it, because the whole movie, there's a major sexuality in the movie. There are many temptresses in the film, a lot of women that are trying to lure Kay in with sexuality. And obviously, Kay doesn't seem interested in them at all, and something is always feeling very off. And so many of the lines and the lack of sexual tension between him and these horny ladies, it's funny to me. There's just this blatant moment where one of the girls is just looking at him like, "You really don't like me, do you?" And I was laughing out loud. I thought it was great. But at the same time, like I said, there is a sadness to that guilt he's carrying inside, not being able to share it, that weight to that feeling, even if it is only insinuated. But yeah, this is really one of the stranger Orson Welles movies, and that's really saying something. I think it is maybe a little bit too lofty to the point of losing its audience at times. And that connection is something that I do miss. Like I said, if maybe there was more of a relationship between the real and the abstract, rather than the abstract fighting the real so much, I think it could have been a lot more interesting. And I think a lot more of the concepts might have found some footing. But that said, I'm going to recommend this movie absolutely if you are a major cinephile, and especially if you are like an Orson Welles fan. But I'm only going to recommend it to the cinephiles, to the hardcore movie fans, because You know, it's not exactly the type of movie you want to watch at the end of the day to unwind. You know, it's gonna be more for the hardcore people. But that is my review. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to plug my website as always. It is deepfocuslens.com. I'm an artist. I do commission portraits, and I also sell prints of my work. If that's something that you're interested in, you can go to the website below. And if you have a question about a commission or a print, you can email me. My email is in the description box below as well. Also, I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons who are great. Guys, thank you so much for your continued support. If you are interested in supporting, the link for that is below, as well as the rest of my social media information. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.